So let us start because we have to finish in an hour, by 3 p.m. Afonso, can you hear us? Yes?
Yes, Pablo,
Okay.
I can.
Good. So thank you all for being here. We are here to have a discussion about the evaluation on the evolving application of the IMF mandate, which we just published on June 17th, and it was approved by the board on June 10th. So basically, as you will have seen, this evaluation, what it does is it tries to analyze the fund's engagement in newer policy areas beyond the fiscal, monetary, financial and exchange rate policies, and focusing in the period after 2012 when the integrated surveillance decision was approved. So what the evaluation finds is that there is a number of operationalization problems that, and proposes some recommendations to try to address them. So to have today's discussion, we have Ceyla Pazarbasioglu, the Director of the Strategy, Policy and Review Department, two Executive Directors, Elizabeth Shortino, the Executive Director from the US, and Afonso Bevilaqua, who is attending online. He's the Director of 11 countries in America, Africa, and Asia, and of his home country of Brazil, and one of the Executive Director's coordinators, board coordinators. And we also have Cyrus Rustomjee, who was the team leader of the evaluation. So basically, what we propose today is to have first Cyrus give us a main overview of the main elements of the evaluation, and then we will engage in a discussion with the participants in the panel, and we will leave the end 15 or 20 minutes or so to have maybe some questions from you, from the audience, if you want to come in. So I think I'll just go directly to you, Cyrus.
Thanks very much, Pablo, and good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you for coming to this session. I'm sparing you a PowerPoint presentation. I thought I'd just briefly read out a snapshot of what we did in the evaluation, what findings and conclusions we came to. Firstly, to explain that the evaluation focused on the application of the fund's mandate to newer policy areas. We use the term newer policy areas. This is to distinguish from the traditional four policy areas that the fund works on: monetary, fiscal, financial, and exchange rate policies. So we looked at issues such as gender, climate, governance, and corruption, digital money, social spending, and other issues. The team that was working on the evaluation focused on the period from 2012, which is when the integrated surveillance decision which guides fund work on surveillance came into being, up until 2023. So essentially approximately a decade of work. We evaluated fund surveillance, and we were clear about that when we first went to the board to say we will only focus on fund surveillance. We will not look at lending and CD unless it entirely encroaches on the work that we are going to be doing, so as to focus attention on a particular set of issues. So we gave attention to three particular issues in the evaluation. One, we wanted to look at the decision-making processes that have guided how the fund engages in these newer policy areas. We were not evaluating the policies themselves. We were not evaluating gender or climate, how the fund is doing, the effectiveness of that work. We were looking at the decision-making that it takes place that brings something new onto the agenda and which the fund then takes forward. So here we looked at issues of inclusivity, coherence of the decision-making process, issues related to resources and risk, including, for example, how budgetary issues, human resources, and risk implications were considered when these decisions were made and as they progressed through to being operationalized. Secondly, we looked at the issue of clarity of the principles of engagement. Here we looked at issues such as how the fund determines what we term in the report the perimeter of engagement. That is, when does the fund engage in surveillance in a newer policy area? And here it's through the filter of macro-criticality, which many colleagues will be familiar with the term that's applied. Then also we looked at the issue of whether the fund provides policy advice and in what context that occurs in surveillance. issues of fund expertise, the depth of engagement in surveillance, the frequency of engagement in surveillance, and issues of uniformity of treatment. So we really tried to unpick critical questions that underpin how the fund proceeds when, or a staff member on a country desk proceeds when thinking about how to apply a decision that's been taken to work on gender, any of the newer areas. Third, we looked at the issue of framework for engagement with partners. In these newer areas, there's a very considerable overlap with other partners, and we wanted to understand what is the nature of the framework engagements with other partners. We looked at the institutional approach for engagement. In all of this, we came to several findings. First, when we looked at decision-making processes, we found that decision-making processes were not fully inclusive. Decisions were undertaken in an ad hoc manner without a strategic long-term anchor for the decisions. Decisions, resource, and risk allocation issues were taken in a piecemeal way. And this resulted in a misalignment between the ambition, the intended goal, the intended scope of the work, and actually the resources that were provided. And we provided illustrations in the report of that. We also found that resource decisions were not fully transparent because of a lack of granular budget data by policy area, by climate, by gender, by governance, etc. And finally, in this area, we found that there was limited ad hoc discussion of risks and the absence of a comprehensive risk assessment. When we looked at the second column, which is the issue of clarity of principles of engagement, we found that there's a lack of clarity in this, and it remains regarding the principles for engagement on structural issues and operationalizing of these in surveillance. In our paper, we set out a number of open-ended questions which we suggested as the fund takes on any of this in the management implementation plan could be looked at. And we suggested as a recommendation a modality for doing so. When we looked at engagement with partners, we found that elements of a coherent approach are in place for engagement with partners, but there's no overarching institutional or comprehensive approach for engaging with partners, notwithstanding there's a proliferation of these arrangements. Finally, we arrived at 4 recommendations. Firstly, that the fund should develop an inclusive, fund-wide institutional strategy to engage in newer policy areas, and it should take a more holistic approach when endorsing individual strategies for newer policy areas by better linking the decisions that are taken relating to their scope, required resources to implement, and the risk management implications. The second recommendation was that management and staff should address operational challenges by producing budget data in a manner that can allow tracking by policy area across all fund activities and operations. We recommended that the board should consider what policy areas need to be tracked and the level of granularity required, balancing the need for more detailed data with the costs and the complexity involved in providing such data. Third recommendation was that management and staff should update the 2022 guidance note for surveillance under Article 4 consultations in order to enhance the clarity of the key elements that we set out in the paper, where we felt that there's ample scope to clarify. And finally, we recommended that the fund adopt an executive board approved high-level statement of principles of engagement with partners. This to establish a coherent best practice framework when the fund is pursuing any particular partnership. Underlying all of our work, and I'm almost at the end here, has been the presence of an ongoing trilemma of challenges that the fund is grappling with as it advances and as the scope of newer policy issues expands. That trilemma is one of an endlessly increasing scope of work The imperative for the fund and the staff working in these areas to maintain and retain traction in surveillance and policy advice, and the context of a largely fixed human and budgetary resource endowment. So with one anchor of a triangle broadly fixed, how to manage an expanding scope and yet maintain traction. And in suffusing every aspect of our evaluation, we came back to this dilemma. Dilemma faced by staff, dilemma faced by management, dilemma faced by the membership. That's the way of life, and it's the fund needing to manage that trilemma, which is absolutely at the source of the heart of the starting point for our evaluation and everything that we've done through it. Here, a particular piece of information is that in our evaluation, we found that not only have there been 5 strategies that have been formally endorsed by the board: governance, gender, climate, digital, money, and social protection. But on top of that, there are 12 other areas that the board has signaled as being macro-critical. AI is not one of them. So we now have 18, and the list is expanding. The challenge to the institution is growing, it's not diminishing. So finding a way to operationalize these newer areas in a manner that is strategic is an imperative for the institution. Lastly, as Pablo mentioned, we had the board discussion a couple of weeks ago. Management broadly supported our recommendations. The board endorsed all 4 of them. And in the mechanism of the IEO and recommendations and evaluations, of course, this now moves to the next stage, which is the management implementation plan, which typically would come about 6 months, approximately 6 months after the board discussion, hence around the end of this year. I think that covers it, and over to the panel.
Thank you, Cyrus, for opening up the discussion. Let me maybe take it at the end of the last comment that you made on this issue of the overarching theme of the evaluation being a trilemma between the fund enlarging the scope of its surveillance, but at the same time in a context of expertise and fixed resources, and the need to maintain traction with high quality advice. So I guess I will ask the panelists, what are your views on this of this framing of the evaluation and the kind of compromises that have to be made to deal with this trilemma? I'll start by you, with you, Elizabeth, for instance.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Pablo, and thank you, Cyrus. And I just want to start by saying this was really an excellent report. These are really challenging issues, and I thought the report itself captured the tensions that we are facing within the institution to try to take on all of these issues, but as you say, do it within a somewhat binding resource constraint. So on the characterization of the trilemma, I think this is a very good way to describe these tensions that we're facing, where the fund may not have the requisite expertise or the policy frameworks within staff just yet, and that means there's a trade-off in terms of broadening scope and still attaining traction within a given level of resources. The report proposes a few different ways to manage this issue, including, for example, prioritizing, reducing scope, relying on other institutions. None of these are a silver bullet. My personal view is that the fund needs, on that trilemma, the fund needs to prioritize traction. I really see this as a quality versus quantity argument, and in an environment where we just concluded a structural increase to the budget for some of these areas, but not all of them, obviously, the focus really needs to be on prioritizing that high quality policy advice on perhaps a maybe more narrow set of topics or a narrow set of issues within these newer topics so that the fund can really make an impact. And I do get concerned that if the fund stretches itself too broadly across all of these areas, we lose credibility. And credibility is really one of the biggest assets I think this institution has, that it can come in and give policy advice that is very well respected and that countries know is founded in core analysis. So to my view on this trilemma is that obviously you can't win it all. You do have constraints on all sides, but maybe the best way is to gradually build up that scope. So you start with your scope fairly narrow on a specific topic. As you build the expertise, as you build the attraction, as you build the experience and the relationships with other institutions, you broaden. And within a resource-constrained environment, that's really going to be the only way to keep that traction. So it's all easier said than done, but that would be where I land on that trilemma issue.
Of course, any one of the panelists, if you want also to intervene, Afonso, I can see you if you want to, indicate with your hand, or we can. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Pablo. Let me also start by, commending you, Cyrus, and the whole IEO team for this comprehensive, insightful, and candid evaluation of a fundamental issue for the funds. I also want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion and for accommodating it in a hybrid format so that I could participate while traveling. I see events like this as hugely valuable in helping the conclusions of IEO evaluations to reach crucial stakeholders beyond the boards, including IMF staff. As Elizabeth, I believe that trilemma is a useful formulation. It clearly outlines the trade-offs the fund faces in deciding to engage in new policy areas. As the fund expands its scope beyond its traditional core mandate, resources may become too thinly stretched, advice may become less focused and potentially of lower quality, and as a result, the fund may actually end up becoming less relevant. Therefore, I believe we need to think hard about which combination of scope, traction, resources maximizes the value added of the fund to its membership. One question that we should always ask ourselves is, are there other multilateral organizations that have more expertise and a clearer mandate in a given policy area? If the answer is yes, I believe the bar for the fund to engage in that policy area should be very high. Thank you.
Thank you, Afonso. So I guess, I would take point of these issues, and I think I would like to touch on cooperation with other institutions also at maybe at a later stage. But I wanted to come into another element that Cyrus was mentioning, which is the principles of engagement for the fund on the newer policy area. So there are different principles: the perimeter, which is defined by macro-criticality, whether or not the fund has to give advice, which is determined by expertise. The depth depends on the relevant urgency, and it finds that there is no clear principle to guide the frequency of engagement. So it finds that in this trade-off that there is always between flexibility and consistency, all these criteria are useful in terms of flexibility of fund engagement in new areas, but it loses somehow the consistency of the approach. And the evaluation does identify specific questions in one of the tables of the evaluation of open questions related to these principles and also to even-handedness. So I was wondering what the panelists' views are on this. There is a clear need to maintain consistency, but on this trade-off, and of course the fund has done a lot on trying to ensure consistency in all these newer policy areas, but we still did find some open questions. So what will be your views on these aspects? I think the evaluation does propose sort of a way forward, thinking about a spectrum of engagement. If you find this is useful or not, let me give you the question.
Thank you, Pablo, and many thanks to Cyrus as well. I fully agree with what Elizabeth said. This was excellent review and very timely. So great. I mean, those who know me know how surveillance is very close to my heart. I think it's the most important mandate of the institution. We are the only institution that has 191 member countries where we do Article 4 consultations, which is our mandate. So, and we take it very seriously as an institution. So I think it's important to go a little bit back in history because, as Elizabeth said, a lot of times surveillance is impactful because we are an institution with rigorous analytical work And we use that for our policy advice, plus we also use the fact that we do it across countries to learn from what we do in one country and what lessons that brings to other countries. So we have strived in many years in the history of the institution to make sure that we have traction, all the aspects that you mentioned in terms of the trilemma and having the resource constraints. I want to just put a bit of a historical context. And remember, in 1990s, we had a lot of discussions on, how do we focus surveillance? I have even a quote here. We must focus surveillance, but that it needs to cover financial sector, it needs to cover capital flows, regional issues, and so on and so forth. And prior to the Asian crisis, I remember we had zero expertise on financial sector in the institution, literally zero. And it was, coming back to what Afonso also said, it was the World Bank who had financial sector experts. And we were, and I know this personally because my first assignment was Norway in early 1990s, long ago, and they had a Nordic banking crisis, and each of the countries resolved the banking crisis differently. So we learned a lot in that process. And at the time, we really understood that something which the fund never looked at before had huge implications in terms of fiscal policies, exchange rate policies, bank sovereign nexus, and so on. So it was a huge eye-opener, and at that time, too, it was decided that we do the FSAPs, which were joint with the World Bank, and that process took its time. And we had the, if we go back to a global financial crisis, these FSAPs, which used to be technical assistance reports, which were voluntary, became mandatory because, US hadn't volunteered for an FSAP, and then we had the global financial crisis. And the decision by the board was to actually have systemic countries to have this as mandatory. All I'm saying this is to underline something Elizabeth said, which is learn as you go. And I think with all these new areas where we are also integrating it into our analysis, building the tools, be it on gender, we had the gender discussion a couple of weeks ago at the board, be it on climate, how do we incorporate climate into our analytical work, on our growth forecast, on our debt sustainability analysis, on our balance of payments gaps. This will take time, but I think we should just see this as a learning process, incorporate these aspects into our surveillance work, and adapt. So I think we need to work on, in my view, two key principles. One is not every issue, so first is macro criticality. So it has implications for the institution when we assess how this impacts country circumstances and also policies. And the second is, it may impact one country at this time, it may impact another country at a different time. So it's not like one size fits all and we should do this for every country every time. We need to use judgment. And let's face it, surveillance, the surveillance when we get traction is when we actually work very closely with the authorities. What is a priority for them, and understanding also their view. So it's very much a two-way street when it comes to surveillance. So really working together with the authorities on identifying the right time and the right focus on what we should be doing. In terms of guidance, we have, of course, one of the recommendations is to update the guidance that we provide. But this was a great innovation. The colleagues who worked on this had, the guidance note is a live guidance note. It has all these sidebars which, as we gain experience, it includes what we learn from one country to the other. So I think it's not, a regular review, but as it's real-time updating of the guidance. And I think that's a great innovation which we are using with us. Lastly, I think comparative advantage is not a great filter, because I think it's important for us to think about what is macro-critical And also, and it'll come back on the collaboration issue, what is it that we need to do and how much we can leverage other institutions. But if an issue is macro-critical, we cannot afford, as the fund, not to work on that issue, but rather to really understand, whether we need to build expertise and in what areas, as it relates to exchange rate, monetary policy, financial sector policies, we will have to incorporate it. And then how to leverage, whether it's sectoral work, other work of World Bank and other MDBs or OECD, to our work and make sure that we understand what the macro implications of that sectoral work is.
I think I would just like to mention a couple of reactions. So you're making a point that, 2 points that we're making also in the evaluation. One of them is the comparative advantage of the fund in terms of signaling and reaching to a number of countries. So that's something also to take in mind in this evaluation. So when you talk about macro-critical policies, the fund is the institution that has the largest outreach and influence in many decision makers in the different countries. The other thing that I wanted to signal is that the evaluation does talk on purpose about the traditional core of the IMF, which is this idea that the fund, the policies of the fund, and you've mentioned financial sector was not an issue at the fund until the late 90s, and it was developed later during the 21st century. Same thing you can say about exchange rates, which were not until the collapse of the Bretton Woods, the way you treat them is different since in the 1970s. So I think that's well captured. But then, of course, to be a little bit more on the engagement, on principles of engagement, we do think that there are still open questions on macro-criticality that need to be addressed, and particularly the issue of frequency, which we think is not clear enough, and there is some sort of, we have found certain pressure on the staff to deal with all these issues at the same time. But I want to take advantage that we have two executive directors here and talk a little bit of another part of the evaluation, which is the decision-making process, okay, which is an important element of the evaluation. And so one of the findings of the evaluation is that the process of engaging in newer policy areas, at the beginning of the process, it's heavily driven by management, at least to start off on the different process, on the different newer policy areas. And then there is some issues of uneven engagement with of the executive board. And also we find the process is not sequenced the right way, in the sense that sometimes the new strategy on the new policy areas, the strategy is decided at some point in time, but then the resources are decided some months later, and sometimes they're given less resources than the initial expectation on the strategy was decided, and the same thing happens to the risk analysis. So I wanted to ask you both, maybe starting with you, Afonso, this time, what are your views on this decision-making process, and how can it be enhanced? I mean, the evaluation does propose a way forward, which is an institutional strategy and prioritization for the fund. But,
Thank you, Pablo. The first issue I want to note is that the IEO's findings on the decision-making process are clearly, carefully considered and based on an extensive review of the documentation and feedback from key stakeholders. The finding that decisions on fund engagement with the newer policy areas were taken in a piecemeal way without a strategic anchor resonated with both executive directors and management. This ad hoc approach led to a lack of prioritization and a misalignment between the ambitions in the newer policy areas and the resources allocated to them, as you just mentioned. One unavoidable consequence of this approach is the unsustainable work pressures on the staff. Another very important finding, in my view, was that the engagement with the executive boards as part of the decision-making process on fund involvement with the newer policy areas was not fully inclusive, a point attested to by most executive directors according to the report. The evaluation found that the extension of the fund's activities was driven primarily by management and some key members with large voting power. The report properly notes the potential impact of such a perception on the fund's legitimacy and support from the membership. And I would add to that that the lack of full inclusivity means that the views of many members were not adequately considered in shaping the fund's engagement with the newer policy areas, which likely led the engagement to be less useful to the membership than it might have been. When you also consider that the expansion of the scope of fund surveillance imposes a disproportionate burden on member authorities, since it requires involving a wider range of stakeholders than is the case for the traditional core areas where central banks and ministries of finance are the counterparts, it's easy to see how all this could potentially reduce the traction of the fund's advice, not only in the newer policy areas, but also in the traditional core, on which the fund has unequivocal expertise, a clearer mandate, and no close substitutes among international organizations. Moving to the recommendation, like other executive directors, I believe that a fund-wide institutional strategy for engagement with newer policy areas is absolutely necessary. When decisions are taken one policy area at a time, it's only natural that you end up with a bias for expansion. Consider that the issues are undeniably important and hence will typically have the enthusiastic support of members and stakeholders at large. Therefore, the only way to avoid mission creep and ensure proper prioritization is to have some framework that forces the board to take comprehensive decisions considering all the policy areas.
Thank you, Afonso. Do you want to?
I mean, just to comment, I agree with the finding in the report that this was piecemeal and ad hoc, and some of that was circumstances just at hand. And but certainly, it would have been nice to have done this in a more holistic way. And I know the board is regularly saying, okay, you've come to us with this new strategy, a strategy update. What are the resource implications, right? That's a constant ask of ours. I think the idea for an institutional strategy is a very good one. Executing it is not so easy, and to make it meaningful. So I do think it's something we should, as a board and as an institution, look into and try to comment on, or try to put into place. Because I agree with Afonso, you know, there is a little bit of a temptation and a pressure, in part because the fund is so well regarded, for the fund to be able to comment on everything and to dive into everything and have a view on a topic that may even be tangential to our mandate but does have, you know, economic implications. So that institutional strategy, if done well, could, as Afonso says, provide a framework and could help us figure out when do we need to comment and when do we really need to dive in and when do we need to just step back. That, if we could achieve that, I think would be very helpful. But again, easier said than done, and you know, I think there a little more thought would need to be put into it, and hopefully it's part of the management implementation plan on how you do this.
Can I add on
please.
this? So when I took over the position of SBR Director, the comprehensive surveillance review was about, you know, it was at the midpoint, so we were finalizing it. And a lot of these aspects were actually part of the CRS, if you go back and look at the report. And the key question at that time was, how do these different aspects interact with each other? Climate change, they were all raised in the CRS. So CRS is the institution's way of looking at how do we do surveillance and what have we learned, what does this mean, comprehensive surveillance review, right? So I think this is a very good product and that's what we proposed at the discussion. This is a very good product to innovate and make it much more relevant in that context, so that, you know, you always are cognizant as the board that there's a lot of pressures on staff. If we have this work stream already, let's innovate it and bring some more of these interlinkages and what that means for our work. And there's a very good example of how we need to be selective. Take health, right? Pandemic. It was very important to look at COVID implications, economic implications, and so on, and we did it. And then there were numerous asks, including from some of our executive directors, to continue working on health issues, right? Mm-hmm. And we said, no, we've done our work. There's WHO. This now rests with them. We can, of course, comment on, when they look at macroeconomic implications, fine. But we are not the institution that should be looking at preparedness and so on and so forth. And yet, when we were discussing RSD, can we include preparedness as part of RSD? So I think it's all good to say this, but it's also good to recognize that there are parts of the board which would like us to look at certain issues. And even though we don't have the expertise, even though other institutions can do it better. So as staff and management, we try to carefully make the priorities, but I think it's also important that we get the full board support to be able to do that.
I think the evaluation does recognize that. I mean, the pressure for doing more things comes from the board and from management. So that's why, this idea of the institutional strategy is to take a step back and see where we are or whether things have been stretched too much. Which brings me to a follow-up question, now taking advantage also that there's many staff here attending today, which is the resource pressures and resource constraints. One of the findings of the evaluation is precisely that because you are extending into new policy areas, the way that you've handled it is through, in some cases through savings, in some cases through some reprioritization, but there's also been work pressures on the staff and unsustainable work pressures on the staff, and I think it's also something that we wanted to highlight in the evaluation. So I wanted to hear your reactions on how to move, moving forward, how can we deal with these pressures, and your views also from both executive directors, and maybe also from Ceyla and Cyrus, of course. Yes. So I don't know. Do I give you the difficult question, Elizabeth?
Sure, I can start on this one. And I just want to clarify, there was a budget augmentation as well. That was another way to manage this. It was a one-off. It's now been, I guess, fully executed. We're at the end of it. But there was also a commitment to return to a flat real budget after that structural budget augmentation. So, I think the issue really does stand, though, that there are always going to be new challenges. The world is evolving rapidly. We know that. And the fund is going to have to find a way to accommodate those new challenges within its budget framework. And the fund has to walk the talk. I mean, we are out there advising countries to undertake prudent fiscal policies. We can't just expand our budget every time a new challenge comes our way. We all know that, right? So the question is how you do that, and you do that without overloading staff. And I will say, being on the board is very concerned about staff being overworked, about the amount of overtime that's going into it. So concerned that we keep saying, give us the budget numbers, how can we help? And then staff and management kind of push back and say, well, that's not entirely your job. But I do think there is a strong concern by the board about how do we address this issue. I don't have any easy answers. I think the report, though, raises has a good recommendation that more data would be helpful. And it is hard, I think, to really crystallize what is the challenge without having the data behind it. And we know that from all of the economic analysis that this institution does. So I'm not a budget expert, but I think having some system, whether that's a new technology system, whether that's a new process, whether it's both, to better nail down that data would help us go a long way to solving that problem. And I think in times past, you could argue that the fund's work was maybe a little bit more straightforward. It is only going to get more complex, as you say, with health coming on the scene and then maybe coming off, with AI, with all of these different challenges that are increasingly having economic implications. It's really now incumbent, I think, on this institution to step up its understanding of what that means for our resources in a more granular way so that we can better manage them.
I'm a bit mindful of the time, and I want to give some time for questions. Maybe just one final issue, Cyrus, on one of the recommendations is with cooperation with other institutions. There is the evaluation is proposing some principles of engagement. The framework currently is quite flexible, but the evaluation finds that this might be losing best practices, and it's proposing setting up frameworks and also a system of monitoring and evaluating the engagement with partners. So I don't know if you want to identify the problems.
Thank you. On that issue, of course, as we went through the evaluation, we found that in every new area that the fund is engaging in, the multiplicity of partners that the fund is working with is growing. And to the extent that fund staff are able to cope with doing traditional core work and engage in these new areas, to the extent that the partnerships are vibrant and efficient, it helps staff in this process. And of course, it helps deliver the fund's mandate. What we find, though, is that the number of partnerships has proliferated. The likelihood is that there are going to be many more partnerships coming at the fund as these newer areas expand. There are many formats to the partnerships. They come in different forms. And we have a background paper indeed setting out a very wide range of types of partnerships that the fund engages in. Collaboration being one of many different forms of partnership, but the fund engages across many others. And there's also a proliferation of guidance, which is required to help staff in their engagement with partners. And on top of all of that, on the upside, there's a very rich experience in this form of engagement. Fund staff are doing their best to engage with partners and collaborate well. Taking all this together, we suggested having a statement of principles setting out how the fund's engagement can optimally work, what are the goals of these partnerships, how can quality of engagement improve. We observed from all the partnerships that the fund works on that there's a dearth of explicit monitoring frameworks in these partnerships. The partnerships come, they grow organically, which is in some sense natural, but there is no overarching focus on monitoring, and there is no explicit self-evaluation framework to allow to pause a little, to think carefully about the quality, the nature, the cost involved in engaging with partners, what the fund is deriving from it, and how to strengthen the quality of that. We don't see it as an absolutely critical universal flaw, but we see that there is a great opportunity, given that the fund is engaging in these areas and the likelihood that there are going to be many more partnerships coming, to gather the information that's available, the best practice that's available, distill it, extract good lessons, identify pitfalls, think ahead to the types of partnerships that are likely to come in the future, receive the guidance from the board on this issue, and develop something along the lines we described as a statement of the principles that would guide the fund as it engages with partners. We think it's an important opportunity, and given that these are explicitly areas where the fund engages with others, these newer areas, we think it's an opportunity we shouldn't miss. We shouldn't wait for another few years and then try and capture the lessons. There's very good lessons. This is not a critique in a certain sense, it's an opportunity. So on to the partners.
I don't know if you want to react to this.
We will do it. It'll add to our overtime. We will do it. What can I say? I think we have to be very careful because these high-level principles can be so high-level that they're useless. Or they cannot be so micro because what we do with the World Bank, what we do with the OECD, what we do with another ILO is very different. But I think setting some, and I don't think there should be so close monitoring of, if in a country there are several in international institutions which are very which are doing a lot of work that is linked to our work, of course country teams will collaborate. But I don't think we need to monitor and make sure and police them, but rather perhaps some high-level principles, as we agreed, as to what information can be shared. Because we also get a lot of IOs come to us and say, well, the World Bank comes to your meetings, your policy meetings, can we also come? And so which the relation with the bank is very different. It's a much more collaborative relationship, many years, we complement each other and so on. So I think it is useful to set, which will help us to say, no, not all IOs can come to our policy meetings because it will not be feasible, and how we share information and so on. But then let teams decide what is most useful to them and to the countries involved. Collaboration is great, but it's also very costly. It takes time to find the right person and so on. So I think we need to be very careful to do it in a way that's most useful for the individual teams.
I guess the main element of evaluation is precisely that. It's costly, so let's find best practices, let's monitor it, let's evaluate it, and as we move into new topics where there is high expertise in other institutions, we just try to take advantage of that. Yeah, I want to open the floor to questions. There's 3 microphones. There are microphones on the corners and in the middle. So please, there's one right here. Sorry.
Also, once again, thank you for the evaluation, very good one. One of the legacies of that evaluation is a figure, a diagram, where you put and you define a subject topic to be that of just signaling or that much closer to a core, more to the topics that we define as core. And that defined by we do surveillance on that topic, we do CD on that. Okay. So for those topics, my question to the panel is, do you believe that we should not put, like Afonso said, a higher bar on governance? We can define a firm-wide institutional framework to agree that a topic is macrocritical. I can tell you, AI is macrocritical. I have no doubt about it. But I can also tell you, we don't have the resources to name that in your diagram as one of those goals. So should we not elevate this decision to the IMFC in order to be that highest standard? That's my question.
That's a difficult governance question. I have my own views, but I prefer directors to maybe react first. I don't know, Afonso, if you want to react, or Elizabeth?
I can go first. I have already said what Alfonso Guerra just mentioned in his question. I think the bar should be really, really high. And we need to be absolutely, clear that the issue is macrocritical, and then the IMF needs to get involved. I think Ceyla mentioned one good example of that with the financial sector in the 90s. Okay? The financial sector became quite relevant after you started having more capital mobility, and became a source itself of balance of payments crisis. So no one would question at that time, after the Asian crisis, for example, that the financial sector should be included in our surveillance. But I think the example of the financial sector is quite different from other topics that have been included more recently, on which, we didn't have the proof of macrocriticality so incisively as in the crisis of the 1990s, and the discussion about including that or not in our daily activities was reached with less consensus than it was the case for the financial sector.
Thank you.
There were so many who were saying the fund shouldn't do financial sector work in the 90s. So many. Why are we doing this? Regulations, what do you understand from regulations? You shouldn't be touching it. No, there was a very similar, and it took the institution 15 years to, really streamline macro-financial work. I think my suspicion is in 10 years' time, climate will be similar. Our balance of payment gaps will be very much determined by climate. So I think. But I think that's why it's very important for the institution, just like financial sector work. What are the transmission channels? What are the tools? How does it impact our key? Does it or does it not impact our DSAs, our growth projections, our balance of payment? I think this is really critical. And use the time, the next, I don't know, 2-3 years, to really understand and embed it to the extent it's relevant to our tools. Because otherwise, I don't think we can give good advice or provide the right direction to the membership.
Okay.
I would just agree on that. And I think your governance question is a good point. And certainly I think there would be a benefit from the IMFC kind of providing that stamp of approval. I mean, really what you want to get at is how, I don't love this newer topics versus existing topics, because it should be a topic, climate is important to fiscal, and it should be integrated in there. And the fiscal policy advice should have the climate or whatever the other topic is. So I almost think that by siphoning off into newer versus traditional, we're doing a disservice to the fund policy advice, because it needs to be, we have this surveillance and we have these topics that are important to every country, and these other issues now feed into them. They're a part of that. So
I fully agree.
Cyrus?
If I may, thank you. The issue of the role of the IMFC was something that we actually discussed a little in our evaluation as we went through it. My colleague Anthony wrote an excellent paper on decision-making processes, and we found in that work that looking at these many, many new areas, macrocritical, deemed macrocritical, newer policy areas, it was always the MD and management through the GPA that triggered the process of starting a newer issue. The IMFC followed by endorsing. So we came to somewhat of a conclusion that in the process of dealing with newer policy issues, the IMFC has tended to play a secondary role, a more diminished role. So we would be just based on the evidence, we're not sure that that would be a catalytic role in an area that Afonso has mentioned. What we did do, because believe it or not, whilst we evaluate, we also try to find practical solutions to the problems that we're identifying. What we did in the report a little bit later was to provide a chart, a graph signaling a spectrum of how the fund could engage. That would be presupposed on having some form of strategic agreement, strategic discussion on how to determine when something new comes in, with what frequency it should be treated, with what depth it should be treated, how often it should be dealt with what expertise the fund should use. And one can consider that when a new issue does come in that may seem macrocritical, it could fit anywhere along the spectrum at one end of the funds dealing with this issue all the time, intensively, in depth, with a regular frequency and with substantial use of fund expertise. On the other, this is an important issue, but it doesn't necessarily have to always be dealt with in depth by all members with regular frequency and with extensive use of expertise. So this is one example of something that might be out there that requires to be dealt with. No doubt if we're here in a year or two, there will be two others as well. How to place them in the spectrum is part of what we feel ought to be the strategic decision-making by the board and management in going forward. Once that's there and there's a periodic strategic overlay, those issues would be able to be addressed internally rather, and I say internally because we're pointing in the evaluation that the challenges and the solutions are here in the house rather than necessarily coming as guidance from the IMFC, at least from the evaluation experience.
Okay, I'm always mindful of the time. I don't see more questions at this stage. I guess, probably using again the example of the spectrum indeed, and the question was also about artificial intelligence. I mean, it would be odd that the fund doesn't talk about artificial intelligence today. So that's the first end of the spectrum, the signaling, the recognizing the issue, but then moving from there into a pure core treatment of that policy that takes years, and meaning, you know, high frequency, high IMF expertise. So that's, I think, the idea that they wanted to propose. I'm going to leave it here. I want to be respectful. I just wanted to thank all the participants, Afonso Bevilaqua, Shortino, Ceyla Pazarbasioglu, and Cyrus Rustomjee, for participating here today in this panel. And of course, we know that the process of this is going to be now a management implementation plan by management and approved by the board for the recommendations that have been endorsed by the board. And we look forward to that. And thank you also for all of you to having come here today. Thank you very much.